Welcome to Lives in Song, a series from Opera Rara with me, Flora Willson, exploring the lives of composers and other musicians through their music. This season, we're focused on the man responsible for some of the most popular music in all opera, and whose best-known works have sometimes obscured the rest of his output. Giacomo Puccini was born just before Italy itself. He rose to compositional prominence just as Verdi was ending his career, and he lived to own motorcars, use the telephone, and supply the recording industry with some of its earliest hits. Well, this season I'll be joined by an array of expert guests to explore Puccini's world and, of course, his life. It's great to have you with us. If you haven't already done so, do give us a follow and click subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future episodes. We're also on all the major social media platforms, so do just search Opera Rara. In our previous episode, Ditlev Rindam and I were exploring Puccini's early years, thinking about his childhood, his musical education, and listening to some of the music he might have known. This episode, Puccini's music is back in the spotlight and on the playlist as we delve into his first opera, Les Willis. Well, I'm delighted to be joined here in the Creative Kin studio in London by opera scholar Alexandra Wilson. We've got lots to talk about today, so let's get started. Alex, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to the studio. It's funny, we've known each other a long time, but I don't think we've ever met quite like this.
Probably not, no.
So I realise something I don't think I know about you is you've been researching Puccini for as long as we've known each other, however long that is, a decade maybe. What is it that drew you to Puccini in the first place? Why him?
Yeah, it's actually a lot longer than that. I mean, I wrote my PhD on Puccini and then turned that into my first book. So I hesitate to say how long
Puccini for ages.
How long ago that was. But it was in the late 90s. So there was lots of work being done on Verdi at that time. There had been quite a lot of snobbery in academic circles around Italian opera, but Verdi had become respectable. Puccini, not quite at that point. So I saw a sort of gap in the market and something that could be researched. I was working on what the critics had to say about Puccini's operas in his lifetime. But also, I mean, I just loved the music. I mean, there's a debate about whether you should research the music you love. But
well, I think it can't do you any harm, can it? I mean, presumably you still love the music.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not ruined anything. Do you have an early memory of listening to Puccini?
My first opera was Tosca on a school trip when I was about 15, I suppose. Quite late on. I wasn't steeped in opera from early childhood. There was no classical music in my home. Okay. And it was Tosca, and we went to the Bradford Alhambra, and we obviously hadn't really been told the story and there were no surtitles. And so I got my coat at the second interval ready to go home. So that wasn't the best of starts. And it's quite ironic how things turned out in the end.
Yeah, wow. But what an incredible opera to get into an entire art form via. I mean, actually, Tosca is the one I tend to take first timers to, actually. It's so intense. It's so efficient, actually. It's really compressed, isn't it?
Yeah,
and very exciting.
So for me, that was opera. And that remains the case.
Yeah. Well, absolutely amazing. So, to get down to business of today's episode, Ditlev and I, in our previous episode, we left Puccini as a teenager, essentially, in Lucca, some years before he got to creating this first opera, Les Willis. So, could you fill in some of the gaps here for us? What happened next for our young composer at that point?
Well, as you may have discussed last time, there were great expectations on Puccini's shoulders from childhood because he came from this family of church musicians. And so his family and local community expected naturally, when he started to show some promise at the keyboard, that he would go down the same route. But in order to escape from that world of church music, which I think he decided early on wasn't for him, he was going to have to go north. And so he went to Milan, took up a place at the Conservatoire, with the help of various people who found the funding for him to go there. And Milan was a very progressive place musically at the time. It's incredible to think that symphonic music, orchestral music, was new music as far as Puccini's generation were concerned. I mean, I don't think a Beethoven symphony was heard in Italy until Puccini's teenage years.
It was too German, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was from too far away somehow. Different tradition.
So going to Milan, Turin would have been similar. These, wealthy, progressive cities in the north gave him the chance to encounter that music and also to hear a lot of opera as well.
It's interesting, he drew on, or at least later claimed that he was drawing on his experiences as a student in Milan when he came to write La Bohème, another one of his obviously incredibly famous operas once he was sort of launched on his way. Was that actually the case, do you think? Was he living La Bohème, as I think he once claimed?
Well, there are stories about how he had to subsist on a life of beans, eating nothing but beans, and couldn't afford to heat his apartment and so on. It's debatable whether there's an apocryphal element to that, whether it was slightly embellished by biographers. But I don't know, there are letters from him asking his relatives for money, saying he's struggling. And certainly he didn't know Paris at the time he wrote La Bohème, so it's more likely that was the environment he had at the back of his mind.
Yeah. And he drew on one of his student compositions, didn't he? Or was it even his graduation piece, the Capriccio Sinfonico, at the start of La Bohème?
Exactly. He recycled a lot of music. I recently heard a disc of Puccini songs that, we hardly know, but so many of them had tunes that later popped up in the operas. So, we tend to associate that sort of recycling with much earlier composers, but actually he was quite resourceful in thinking this piece is otherwise going to go to waste, so I'll use this.
Yeah. Do we know very much, or do we know any of his other very, very early works? I mean, are they still out there?
Not really. I mean, he wrote quite a few string quartets.
Right.
He wrote sort of not full symphonies, but sort of symphonic style short pieces. As you say, the Capriccio Sinfonico was recycled. But no, not really.
Yeah. Well, at the end of our previous episode, I mentioned that the Milan-based music publisher Sonzogno ran this music competition for a one-act opera, a new one-act opera in 1883, and Puccini entered. And he didn't win. Tell us a bit more about that.
So the music business in Italy at this time was dominated by the publishing firm of Ricordi. And he basically controlled everything.
He was Verdi's publisher, for
Exactly. So this was the firm with the money, with the clout that could distribute works internationally. Sonzogno was a sort of new kid on the block, a new entrant into this field. He was a publisher of books, and he saw an opportunity to move into music publishing. Had great success with importing French works to Italy for the first time, which met with some resistance from the Italian musical establishment, because obviously it was diluting the previously very inward-looking Italian operatic culture. But Sonzogno was a savvy commercial guy, so he had success with that. But he was also really keen to sort of kickstart a new type of Italian opera among young composers. And so he sponsored these competitions for one-act operas, and there were several of them. And Cavalleria Rusticana would win the one in 1890, but this, as you say, was 1883. So Puccini was encouraged to give this a go by Ponchielli, who was his teacher. And he wrote Les Willis in its first version. He didn't win, as you say, and he didn't even get an honourable mention, despite the fact that he knew almost all of the judges. So there's a few stories about this. One, that his writing was too illegible to read, and the other that maybe there were some machinations in the background from Ricordi, who didn't want him to win, so he could then swoop in. But again, not absolutely sure that this is true.
Jury's still out. Perhaps we should say that actually Ricordi was so powerful. He also he was an impresario in theatres, wasn't he? He was actually running theatrical seasons as well as publishing and publishing journals as well as publishing music. So these guys really did. It was a bit of a racket.
So the composer would give their work effectively to these publishing firms, who would then manage the production of it and take all that out of the hands of the composer themselves.
Yeah, so there was a lot at stake. Well, look, before we go any further, let's get a sense of what Les Willis actually sounds like. And where better to start, as Julie Andrews taught us, than at the very beginning. The very start of the prelude to Puccini's first opera, Les Willis, as played by the London Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Mark Elder. And that's from Opera Rara's recording of the complete opera. And of course, we'll be hearing more from that recording shortly. Alex, there's so much to enjoy there. I mean, I was just grinning like a loon. It's such beautiful instrumentation apart from anything else. That airy woodwind scoring, it's just gorgeous.
Yeah, I mean, when he was a student, he was noted for his symphonic talent.
Right, okay. So right from that very, very early stage.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the thing that stood out.
It's such sophisticated writing for a composer who was, 25 when he wrote this?
But also, I mean, even in that short snippet, we heard 3 fantastic melodies.
Well, exactly. The tunesmith, as he was once dismissed, and I hope we can now celebrate him as someone who is a tremendously talented melodist.
Yeah.
Just the ease with which this stuff pours out.
Yeah.
And it seems so easy, at least. I guess we may come to how he wrote later. I wonder, I hear just a touch of Wagner in that bass line that's sort of rising. It's just the slightest hint of Parsifal, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, his generation were really into their Wagner. And again, this was seen as a threat to the Italian operatic tradition.
Yes, I mean, this is back to Ditlev and I were talking last time about the kind of anxieties around the Italian opera tradition, and this is a response to that, isn't it? Before we go any further, tell us a bit about what Les Willis is actually about. Can you just sort of lay out the plot for us?
Yeah, it's a fairly compact story, really. It's about a woman and her beloved who are separated when he goes off to collect an inheritance from a relative. And while he's away, he tells her she mustn't worry about anything. He will be faithful to the end.
It's all bad signs, isn't it, when all of those things start adding up?
Inevitably, he is, seduced by someone else. And this is all taking place in Germany. And his beloved Anna, she dies of a broken heart because he's gone, as you do.
Well, it has been known, yes, in opera.
And then there are these sort of forest beings, these ghosts of jilted women, known as the Willi, who will basically haunt any man who dances with them. So when he returns from his trip away, he finds out what's happened and so on, and he duly dances with them and dies. Yeah,
the jilted women, the ghosts, ballet lovers may know them from Giselle, don't they? They do turn up every so often
Which
in the
was
mid-19th century.
Several decades earlier than this, and that was the most famous reworking of this old Central European legend.
I was going to say, where did this story actually come from? Because it certainly wasn't Puccini's, but tell us a bit about the story's genesis.
Well, his librettist, Fontana, took it from a short story by a French writer called Alphonse Carr, but he in turn had taken it from earlier sources. I don't know who the author of the original version was. It's a legend, as these things often were, that would have been just there in folklore for a long time.
Yeah, interesting that it seems so obviously a kind of capital R romantic story that I guess by the end of the century was potentially getting a bit old-fashioned.
Yeah.
And yet Puccini and Fontana ended up working together on that. But Fontana was sort of handed to Puccini, wasn't he? That this was a pre-made libretto that he had sort of hanging around.
Yeah. He was, I think, 9 years older than Puccini. He was well established already as a writer. And so he was the sort of, older figure guiding the younger. But Puccini did respond to it enthusiastically, precisely because he said literally that it would give him, he saw the symphonic potential in it.
Yeah, which I guess is that the later Puccini's capacity to conjure atmosphere. He must have had a look at this story and thought, yes, I can see potential in this.
Yeah.
All those sort of the woods and everything. Tell us a bit, this opera is actually technically an opera-ballo, isn't it? What on earth is that?
Well, literally an opera with bits of ballet in its original incarnation.
Right.
So,
was that a standard genre at this time in Italy?
I don't think so.
I can't think of any others.
No. So, yes, it's got some long intermezzo passages, if you like, that are, normally as we would hear it these days, or it would be, purely orchestral, but at the time would have been danced.
Well, I suppose it's one of these things where even in the later 19th century, opera and ballet were much closer to each other than we might now expect, where we see them as quite separate things, except perhaps in venue terms.
Well, I mean, there's a huge tradition of that in France, ballet.
Yeah,
was
exactly.
very much the thing. I mean, you had to put a ballet in. Italian composers would take their operas to France and they'd be forced to write a ballet to shove in, whether they wanted to or not. But that's not the case in Italy.
No.
So it is a bit of an oddity.
Well, look, I have to say, I love Puccini's ballet music for this opera, so I can't actually resist playing a bit of it now. Let's listen to the opening of the second part of that orchestral interlude you mentioned, this intermezzo. The opening of La Tregenda, the second half of the orchestral interlude from Puccini's Les Willis, featuring a wild ballet of the fairies of the opera's title, played there by the London Philharmonic Orchestra, conducted by Mark Elder on Opera Rara's recording. This is, I think, probably my favourite part of this score, actually. There's a part of me wants to be a ghost of a jilted maiden. The energy here is really remarkable and just, I think, showcases Puccini's way with rhythm, actually. There's so much dynamism in this as it sort of drives along.
Yeah, I'm reminded, actually, listening to that, of the section in Manon Lescaut, which would be his first really successful opera in 1893, when she's got to leave her home and escape in a hurry and is gathering her jewels. And there's a frenetic passage. It's really similar, actually.
Yeah, he was so good at using, cross rhythms, I suppose, where there's a bit of sort of tension in the rhythmic construction, so that you're he's sort of pushing the orchestra along, or the listener pulling us along. It's very exciting. I was really surprised to find that the great 20th century Italian opera expert, Julian Budden, whose works I'm sure we've both spent a lot of time reading, particularly on Verdi, he calls this intermezzo a miniature ride of the Valkyries. Which, do you agree? I don't quite hear that, but
no.
Do you think Wagner's lurking in this bit?
Well, I mean, Wagner's lurking throughout Puccini's style, generally. As I say, I homed in on Manon Lescaut, but actually Manon Lescaut is itself highly influenced by Wagner. So, yes, I suppose I can see that.
But this is sort of Ride of the Valkyries on a tiny scale, perhaps, in that case. Okay, do we know anything about actually how Puccini went about writing this opera? I mean, he was unusual. So later on, he would be very fussy about his librettos, wouldn't he? And he would intervene an awful lot and work very closely with librettists. This was, I suppose, unusual. He was only in his mid-20s and he was effectively handed a libretto by a much more senior figure. But do we know anything about his actual working practices?
I mean, he must have written this at some reasonable speed.
There wasn't very long, was there, between him graduating in the summer from the Conservatoire in Milan and then I think the deadline was the end of December?
December, that's right. So, yeah.
So he turned it around very quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But even though it's just one act, it's still a sizable length.
Yes. No, remarkable that he could work as fast as this. Do we know... Did he know much about the singers he was writing for, or was that a kind of secondary consideration?
I don't think at this stage that they were out of the pattern of writing for specific singers, perhaps by this stage.
Well, I suppose in fact for this, of course, the performance. I realise having asked that question, the performance was a kind of happy accident after the competition, which he didn't win. Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, look, I think it's high time we actually listen to some singing, since it's an opera after all. So here is Roberto. He is the opera's tenor love rat. Here he is assuring the heroine that he is going to be absolutely faithful to her. It was you who shared the games and caresses of my childhood. The aria Tu dell'infanzia mia from Puccini's Les Willis, sung there by tenor Arsène Sogomonian with the LPO conducted by Mark Elder. That vocal line, Alex, I mean, it's recognisably Puccini even at this really early stage again. Do you have a theory as to what makes Puccini's tunes so obviously his?
I mean, there's a sort of suppleness, isn't there, to the rhythm, and a sort of expansiveness and openness to the melodic lines. I feel that he, even though we know this character is going to be a rat, it's so moving. It's so tender.
It's very beautiful. I mean, Puccini, he seems to inject so much humanity into the vocal line, and yet, I don't know whether, I think the orchestra might know it's not going to turn out okay. You know, that horn that goes ba 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 on slightly the wrong note, just sort of gets in there, just slightly needling. You just think, ooh, yeah, the brass have got their eye on you.
But really beautifully sung there.
But very beautifully sung, yeah. I mean, these are hard melodies to make a sound as easy as that, aren't they? It's tricky stuff to sing,
and yet it's got a sort of naturalness to it. I think that is it. That Puccini's operas are so realist, even though this isn't a realist subject. The emotion is real.
Yes, and I suppose again the fact that he did write this so quickly, as well as when he was so young and so relatively inexperienced, only makes it more extraordinary that he put all this work in and he manages to make it sound so effortless. It really is a remarkable thing. We've already talked about Verdi, but who were Puccini's other major musical influences at this point, do you think?
I think it's actually quite hard to point to specific influences from Verdi. And we've already talked about Wagner being a really fashionable figure to want to imitate for all of Puccini's generation. He was very influenced. He was keen on his Massenet. I think Massenet is an influence in the vocal writing.
So kind of just slightly older than Puccini, French.
Yeah. Sometimes gets lumped in with him as another, rather snobbishness about Massenet and Puccini.
Yeah, well, and I suppose the snobbishness was always about operas that were in fact too full of tunes. They were too easy to enjoy.
That and the fact that they might appeal too much to women.
Yes.
Was a charge against both of them.
Yes, yeah.
But also Bizet. There are some of the choruses in this work are, take a little something from Carmen, I think. So all sorts of figures.
And I suppose Bizet was another real master orchestrator, actually. He was so good at sort of playing the orchestra like an instrument, finding the colours and really making it sing, essentially, which I suppose, again, is certainly one of the things I value about Puccini's music.
Yeah.
Really wonderful. So, all right, Les Willis had its world premiere 31st of May, 1884, I gather, in Milan at the Teatro del Verme. Tell us a bit about that, because it's not the Milanese opera house we've all heard of, La Scala. Where did the Verme fit in here?
It was a theatre it was more of a popular theatre, and it put on an eclectic range of different types of entertainment, some real popular culture as well as opera. But we've kind of missed a bit, because how did the work actually get staged if it didn't win the competition? Well, Fontana felt that Puccini had been wronged and assembled a group of powerful people in the musical world to, Puccini would come and play the score through for them. And they decided it was worth raising the funds to put it on. And so they clubbed together, raised the money, and that staging was able to take place. And it was very, very successful.
Yeah, I think, am I right in thinking it was so successful that they actually added some extra performances, because it was this opportunity at the end of the theatre's season to actually make some extra money, because people seem to be willing to pile in to see Puccini's work.
There seems to have been quite a flexible attitude to how many performances of any given opera would be put on in those days.
Well, I suppose it was very responsive to the kind of commercial success, wasn't it? Yeah. I guess that's, in a funny kind of way, a rather modern way of thinking about opera, but not a way we now stage opera. It's more how musicals work, for instance.
You know your dates.
Yeah, exactly.
But it got very good reviews. And again, they were talking about the symphonic element at that stage still. That was what stood out. But Ricordi then pounces and signs Puccini up for his stable of composers, which was a fantastic advantage to Puccini and set his global career in motion. And Ricordi wanted to do something else with Les Willis. He wanted it to be reworked somewhat, so it could become a larger scale work in 2 acts. Okay,
so I suppose did Ricordi just feel that one act was too insubstantial? It was too obviously connected to the Sonzogno competition, perhaps? Was there some kind of attempt to make it into something more Ricordi style?
Yeah, I mean, a one-act opera is a bit of an oddity, because it's not going to really fulfil an evening. It can't fill a complete evening, so it has to be put on with something else. I mean, that did happen in those days, but bear in mind we're still 6 or 7 years ahead of Cavalleria Rusticana, which really sets in motion that trend for one-act operas that could be assembled with all sorts of other works. So at the stage when Puccini's writing, it was a bit of a, the fact that it was one act marked it out as a juvenile work.
Yes, yeah, okay, interesting. Why do you think that actually one act or two, we don't hear it more often today?
Several things. First, we've already mentioned how it's set in this sort of romantic world that was a bit old-fashioned. And when you look at Puccini's other works, they're really to do with... They're more modern in spirit. They're to do with proper realism.
Yeah.
So in terms of its subject matter, it was a bit odd. The dance elements, that was a bit odd. And also because it had been written for the one-act format, he hadn't really had the scope to flesh out the characterisation. The plot line is a bit thin, even once padded out to 2 acts. It's very, very beautiful.
Yes.
But somehow theatrically, it hasn't perhaps offered as much as his later works would to theatres wanting to stage it.
Yeah, and yet such an interesting piece. Are there bits of it, whether musical or dramatic, that you think kind of stand out from the opera, that actually make it quite different to what else was going on in Italy operatically at this time? Are there sort of traces of the Puccini to come, effectively, in this, aside from this kind of glorious melodic gift that, of course, he had?
As you say, it's outstanding melodically, it's interesting orchestrally. Yeah, maybe that element of orchestration signalled something new, because by the time you get to the Verismo composers of the 1890s, his contemporaries, Mascagni, Leoncavallo and so on, they were doing something new in a way, but in another way, they were almost more old-fashioned than late Verdi. Well, they definitely were more old-fashioned than late Verdi because they tended to be number operas.
Well, exactly, whereas Falstaff, Verdi's final opera, just sort of almost there are so few numbers in that. It's this extraordinary musical fabric.
So in technical terms, there you could say a little bit conservative and backward-looking, whereas Puccini was really going down a different path from those contemporaries.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's something that I often wonder that, of course, looking back from now, we're so tempted to sort of look at anything from early Puccini and sort of say, oh, well, of course, he was bound to become the next big thing after Verdi in Italian opera. And it's trying to work out whether that might have already seemed relatively clear to his contemporaries at this stage, or whether really, no, it's with the benefit of hindsight that we can see that.
Yeah, it is with the benefit of hindsight, because at this stage, it really wasn't quite clear, because there was a whole generation of these young composers coming up. So we've mentioned Mascagni, Leoncavallo, there was Cilea, Giordano, Catalani, all of them sort of the same sort of age, all of them vying to be the next Verdi. And it certainly wasn't clear that it was going to be Puccini at that point. In fact, when Cavalleria Rusticana comes out, everybody thinks Mascagni is the one who's going to charge ahead. Yeah. Whereas, in fact, he wrote loads and loads, but really was a bit of a one-hit wonder in some ways.
In the longer term.
So Puccini didn't initially stand out. It was only with Manon Lescaut that it really becomes clear. But having that backing from Ricordi is crucial, because that meant that once Ricordi had sort of thought, we have got something special here, he could really put all his economic might behind Puccini. And the other composers of this generation thought, well, that's not very fair. They thought he was being overhyped, but I think in the end, Puccini was deserving.
Time has told. Well, look, this is effectively all a trailer for our next episodes to come. In our next episode, in fact, I'll be joined in the studio here by Opera Rara's very own artistic director, Carlo Rizzi, to talk about conducting Puccini and exploring some of Carlo's life in music as well as Puccini's. But before then, it's time for our regular Ask Opera Rara segment. As always, if you'd like to get in touch with a query, no matter how large or small, please do email us at ask@opera-rara.com or use the hashtag AskOperaRara on our social channels. The links are in the show notes, and we love to hear from you, and we do respond to every message, so please do get in touch. We've had a couple of great queries this week for both of us, Alex. Firstly, we've got one from Rory on Blue Sky, who asks, what books should I read to learn more about Puccini? And, well, I think over to you for this one first, and I'll fill in the gaps if you don't do the obvious thing.
Yeah. Well, we mentioned Julian Budden. So he's written a big life and works of Puccini that, talks you through what happened in his life, analyses the works. That gives you a great deal in one volume. There's also a book by Michele Girardi that's the same sort of deal, but rather more technical. So it depends how analytical you want to go.
Yeah. And then there are my books of Alex Wilson.
So my first book was The Puccini Problem, which talks about his reception in his own lifetime and how he became caught up in all sorts of debates about what the new Italian nation was going to be. And it also unveils this surprising story of his works not being as successful with the critics at first as we might expect them to be.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I've also written a little book about La Bohème, if that's anyone's particular favourite.
Oh, wait, it surely must be. There must be people out there who are La Bohème lovers, even among the Opera Rara audience. All right, thank you. We've got a second question to finish with. This is from Esperanza in Mexico City, who asks, why do you think Puccini's operas have had such a big staying power and are heard so often? I think this is in some ways the million-dollar question with Puccini, isn't it? What is that magic ingredient that has kept us all, listening again and again? I don't know. What do you think on this one?
Well, I mean, the music is just perennially popular and, wonderful. Also, it's the sheer humanity and the modernity of his works, I think. I always feel, there's a tendency these days to want to update operas. Theatres like to do this. It allows them to ring the changes on a relatively small core of canonical operas that people tend to see again and again. And I always feel that with Puccini, it works much better than with, say, dare I say it, Verdi, because there is, take an opera like La Bohème, it just can be transplanted to any period. It can be transplanted to now with ease, without anything feeling strained. Those people feel like we are now. They haven't dated.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, that he was obviously drawn to these big, I hate to use the word universal, but they are big universal themes in the sense of, friendship and love and loss and death and betrayal and those things that I think presumably all humans have always cared about and that they still say something to us. Yeah. And there's something so beautifully open and accessible in some ways about some of Puccini's music, at least, that really kind of grasps us. Also, I think for me, this is to do with the fact that actually Puccini's whole way of writing music effectively informed the ways that, say, film music ended up emerging. And that means that actually there have been generations of us who have effectively been reared on Puccini, whether we realise it or not. So of course we love Puccini because we've been so used to this being the kind of soundtrack music that's just out there.
And he gets criticism retrospectively for that, for having anticipated, popular culture.
Yeah, exactly. Poor old Puccini. He's you can never win. But what music? Look, that's it for this episode. It's great to have had you with us, Alex. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Thank you for joining us. There are links to all the music featured in today's episode, featured in our show notes on the Opera Rara website. That's www.opera-rara.com. I'm Flora Willson, and my guest today was Alexandra Wilson. Lives in Song is produced for Opera Rara by Creative Kin. To find out more, visit creativekin.co.uk. Special thanks to our producer, Jason Caffrey. This show's executive producer is Zachary Vanderberg. Our audio engineer is Phoebe Murdoch, and our videographer is Robin Barrage. Lives in Song is brought to you by Opera Rara, and by the generosity of listeners like you. Opera Rara is all about uncovering and sharing the hidden gems of the operatic world, giving new life to music that deserves to be heard. Your generosity helps us share rare operas and songs with audiences around the world. If you love Discovery as much as we do, you can help keep the music alive by visiting www.opera-rara.com/support and make a donation. Thanks for listening and for being part of the Opera Rara community.